Family, welcome back. Practical Purpose Podcast. I'm your boy, Dr. Williams. Listen, today we got a topic we got to talk about. We've got to talk about perspective. Perspective is so critical in your life because perspective determines how you make decisions. Perspective determines what you do. Come on, bring me my coffee, man. Thank you, sir. Perspective determines what you do in your life. It determines the decisions that you make. So it's critical and it's important for us to understand perspective and understand how we should be diagnosing things in our lives, how we should be looking at things in our lives. Let me say something to you. If you have people around you that have the same perspective as you on every topic, you're not going to be able to grow. So we're going to talk about perspective today. We're going to talk about how we should be looking at things around us, how we should be diagnosing problems in our lives, and how it is that we should be understanding how to deal with people who have a different perspective. We're going to be talking about that today. Listen, this episode, I always want to say this, is sponsored by the Berry Group. You see the Berry Group here. Brokered by eXp Realty. If you're looking to buy a house, you're looking to sell a house, looking to buy property, sell property, reach out to the Berry Group. My boy, Wilmot Berry, Orangeburg, South Carolina, Columbia, Charleston. Listen, 60 seconds. We're going to talk about perspective. Let's go.
How excellent are you? How excellent are you on your level? Like you spend so much time talking about other people at your job. How excellent are you on your level? Are people benefiting from your excellence?
Say 1 2. Say 1 2. Yeah. 1 2. Say 1 2. Yeah. Say 1 2. Say 1 2. We living life with a practical purpose, making every day worth it. Live from the dungeon, we go deeper than the surface, leading with wisdom from the streets to the churches. Searching, what seeking you find? We speaking right to your mind. The sun ain't fighting to shine, no diamonds either. Light hit the Jews and turn fools to believers. Steady making moves and teaching truth to the leaders. Use all these tools just so you can supersede us as real. Say 1 2. Yeah. Say 1 2. Say 1 2. Yeah. Say 1 2. Say 1 2. Yeah. Say 1 2. Say 1 2. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey guys, welcome back to my dad's channel, Brian Williams. Y'all have to subscribe, comment, and follow my dad because he teaches about Jesus and God, and he does podcasts, and we should be good about that. Everybody watch him. Bye.
All right, so let's talk about perspective. Because I would suggest to you that the way you're handling things in your life is primarily due to how you see them. Let me say that again. The way that you're handling things in your life, whether or not there's problems, whether or not there's relationships, whatever that may be, the way that you're handling those things in your life are due primarily because of your perspective. How you see those things, how you diagnose those things, right? And so we're going to talk about perspective from a practical standpoint. We're going to look at what shapes our perspective, right? And then we're going to look at the spiritual side of perspective. We're going to analyze a story in the Bible in which perspective is a critical piece to how these people saw what they were facing. Listen, so what is perspective? Perspective is a mental view. It's how you see, watch this, and it's how you diagnose what you see. Right? So if you don't understand how you're diagnosing the problem or how you're diagnosing the situation in your life, then you're going to have a problem solving it correctly. Right? If you go to the doctor and the doctor misdiagnoses you, then they can't prescribe the right medication to solve the problem. And so the way that you see your situations, the way that you see the world, The way that you see things around you is going to determine what you do. And if it determines what you do, it ultimately determines where you go and what you become. And so it's so critical for us to understand that the basis or the substratum of what it is that we're trying to face and what it is that we're trying to do in our lives is based on how we actually view those things. It's based on how we view those things. Listen, I read this quote. It said this: what we see depends greatly on what we look for. Let me say that again. What we see depends greatly on what it is that we look for. And so often we have a negative perspective on life. And so we look for the negative in everything. It's called pessimism, right? The glass is always half empty in our lives, right? 99 things could go right, but we're going to focus on the one that went wrong. And for some of us, that is our problem. We focus too much on one thing, one particular aspect. And this is why it's critical to have a circle around you of people who may have a different perspective on things than you do, because they will help you see another perspective. Pecan Tan says, and our beliefs about those things. We're going to get there. We're going to get there. All right. And so what we see depends greatly on what we look for. And sometimes a change in perspective is all we really need. Sometimes it's not a matter of competency to be able to solve a problem. Sometimes it's not a matter of intelligence to be able to solve a problem. A lot of times it's a matter of perspective. I didn't see it right. I didn't see it from this angle. I saw it from a different angle. So I didn't see what somebody else saw at all. Right. And if you looked in the thumbnail, you saw it was a picture. And what I see when I look at the picture is two people, a male and a female, looking at each other. But then there are other people that see an apple in the middle. So often we could be looking at the same problems as someone else and seeing something totally different than what they're seeing. And that's because we have a differing perspective. And it's so sad because now we live in a world in which if you have a different perspective, then you can't be friends with that person. If we have a differing perspective, then we can't converse with each other. If we have a differing perspective, in a lot of cases now in our world, people are being unalived because of a different perspective. And it's critical because if you're going to be a relational person, meaning you're going to have relationships with colleagues, you're going to have relationships with people around you. You're not living like Sister Act 2. You're not living in a house by yourself all the time. You're going to have relationships. Then you have to understand how to deal with differing perspectives. Listen, if you call yourself a leader, you're getting paid to solve problems. And in order to solve problems, you have to be relational. And in order to be relational, you've got to be able to understand differing perspectives. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but you have to be able to understand differing perspectives. Listen, the smallest shift in your perspective can transform your life. The smallest shift in your perspective can transform your life. When you begin to diagnose things, when you begin to see things from a different perspective, it can change how you see the world around you, thus changing how you deal with the problems that arise every day, and then changing ultimately your destiny. I say this to my students all the time and to my kids. Listen, daily decisions determine your destiny. Let me say that again. Daily decisions determine your destiny, and perspective influences our decisions. Then perspective has the potential to deter or drive us into our destiny. right? And so if those daily decisions I make are based off of how I view the world, if they're based off of how I see the world around me, then ultimately the way I see a thing is going to determine my destiny later on. And sometimes I'm not trying to get into the spiritual side of this thing, but sometimes God can't bring us into what he wants to bring us into because we don't see it properly. Sometimes we can't walk into the things that we're supposed to walk into in our lives because we haven't diagnosed it the proper way. We haven't seen it. Peter could have kept walking on the water had his perspective stayed the same. He started looking at different things. He started feeling the effects of different things. It's critical because in that text it says he saw the wind. Well, Peter never saw the wind. None of us have. But he saw the effects of it, and it changed his perspective. And it's critical, if we want to walk into what we're supposed to walk into, that we have the right perspective on our lives. Listen, it's not necessarily what you look at, it's what you see. It's not necessarily what it is that you're looking at, it's what it is that you're seeing. Because we can be looking at the same thing and seeing something totally different. My youngest son, Caleb, and it's interesting because we're going to talk about a biblical character later named Caleb. But Caleb, my son Caleb, not the biblical character, he made some mistakes, right? He's 12 years old. He's going to make some mistakes. We get it. And he's a boy. So he's made some mistakes, and he had to face some consequences for those mistakes. And what he didn't understand was because of the fact that he doesn't have a parent's perspective. So I said, Caleb, why are you facing this consequence? Like, why is it that you can't use this cell phone for a while? And Caleb said, because I said something I wasn't supposed to say. No, sir, that wasn't why. The reason is because you disobeyed what your parents told you to do. We looked at the same problem, but we had a different perspective. And that's perhaps why people don't understand you. Because sometimes your perspective can be seen as strange when you see things differently than someone else. And in the world that we're living in, that's becoming unacceptable. To not see things the way everybody else sees them. Perspective is critical. PK Tan says he lost his perspective, so his thoughts and behavior changed. Absolutely. And so the way we think about a thing, the way we move towards a thing is fueled by how we see the thing. And so your thoughts and your behavior change because your perspective on something changed. And I'm trying not to get ahead of myself, but Darius Daniel says this. He calls it the theory of perspective. Where you sit determines what you see, and what you see determines what you do. Let me say that again. Where you sit determines what you see, and what you see determines what you do. And the reason why we can look at the same thing, see something different, respond to it differently, act on it differently, is because we have a different viewpoint because of where we're sitting. See, when we were giving consequences to our son, our viewpoint was based on sitting in a parental seat, right? In leadership, and I work in school leadership. And in school leadership, oftentimes the decisions that are made from leadership don't make sense to everybody else in the building because we're sitting in different seats. So this decision about this young man was made because I see what kind of car he gets out of. I see what it smells like. I see what he's dealing with. And so because I know that and you don't know that, oftentimes it makes more sense for me to make a decision that you won't understand because you don't sit where I sit. And so where you sit determines what you see, and what you see ultimately determines what you do, which is the theory of perspective as coined by Dr. Darius Daniels. And so it's important that we understand that people are going to see things differently from us because of where they're sitting. Appreciate you. People are going to see things differently because of where they're sitting. And that's why sometimes we have to learn how to be reflective people. Because when you are reflective, you don't just stay where you're sitting. Oftentimes you have to take a step back. Right? And sometimes the only way to see the bigger picture is to take a step back. Sometimes you got to take that day off of work and reflect on how you should handle things when you get back. Sometimes you have to go into your secret place and have a conversation and reflect on how should I be dealing with my kids? How should I be dealing with my spouse? Sometimes you've got to change where you're sitting so that you can see something differently. And it's important, and it's critical to your success, especially in relationships, because in relationships, we think that we're always right. Right. And I'm not just talking about marriage relationships, in any relationship. We think that we're always right. And oftentimes we're not willing to see another perspective. Listen, all misunderstandings come from not wanting to or not understanding someone else's perspective. All misunderstandings come from not wanting to or not understanding someone else's perspective. Listen, Ladare says, it's nothing with stepping back and reflecting. It helps you to see different. It may be better. And this brings in a whole nother issue, especially, and I know this is not the dungeon, this is not the moment of clarity, but in leadership, right? Because I know my target audience a lot of times are church folk. And in leadership, in our churches, a lot of times, your pastor been pastoring 80 years, 40 years, 30 years, and they're not willing to see another perspective. And I'm not talking about things on morality or values or character or biblical things. I'm just talking about how we're going to run the church service. They're not willing to see a different perspective. And when you're unwilling to at least consider a different perspective, then you're also saying that you're so prideful that you believe that your way is the best way and your way is the only way to get something done. And I'm learning as a leader that my way is not always the best way, nor is it the only way to get something done. Listen, so all misunderstandings come from not wanting to or not understanding someone else's perspective. And I would suggest to you that most of the time it's the not wanting to. We don't want to understand someone else's perspective. And listen to this. Sometimes just understanding someone else's perspective does not mean you have to agree with their perspective. See, a lot of times we have strife in relationships. And when I say relationships, I'm not just talking about marriage. I'm talking about relationships on your job. I'm talking about relationships with your people. Oftentimes, we have so much strife in relationships because we're unwilling to hear another perspective. And we've equated hearing the perspective of someone else to actually agreeing with it. And I don't want to talk politics, but a lot of that, we see that happening in politics, especially in our country. I can hear your perspective and disagree with it and still have respect for you as a person, right? And so all misunderstandings come from not wanting to hear someone else's perspective. Brian says, my church, my rules. My church, my rules. Right. And so it's critical for our success in whatever arena we work in and whatever it is that we do, that we understand that a differing perspective is not necessarily a bad thing. It should grow us. And even if it doesn't grow us in that area, watch this, it should grow us in our relational intelligence. It should grow us in how we see things. Listen, I'm not going spiritual yet, but I got to use this example. Jesus had a bunch of disciples. He had more than 12. And then one day he said, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you have no life in you. And they thought he was talking about cannibalism, and a bunch of them left. They left him down with 12, right? And then he went up in a mountain one day to be transfigured, and he took 3 of them with him, not the other 9. And those 3 got a different perspective of who he was than anybody else did. And so oftentimes our perspective is so critical because it shapes our worldview and it allows us to be more relational. Their relationship with him grew because they saw him a different way. And the way you see people, even if you disagree with their perspective, it should allow you to see people in a way that helps you respect them or know, I need to put you out of this circle. I don't need to converse with you on a regular basis. And perspective will help you make those decisions. Miss Sarah, Lord have mercy, I can't read all that. Yeah. Ashley says it's not necessarily easy, but it's effective. Right. Our perspective has to change, or the way we look at perspective. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to agree with someone who has a different perspective than you. But even in the disagreement, you should learn something about that person or a viewpoint about that topic that you may not have heard before. It's critical. It's critical. Right? So you got to step back to hear a different perspective. Listen, how you diagnose what you see determines how you deal with what you see. The way that you diagnose what you see ultimately determines how you deal with what you see. And so we talked about that. We talked about the fact that if you go to the doctor and you get a bad diagnosis, you can't fix the problem effectively. And so how you diagnose it, when we're looking at problems in our life, we're going to get to this, you've got to look at it through the proper perspective. And sometimes it takes a person saying something to you that is offensive for you to see the proper perspective. And I heard somebody say this. I'm not going to quote his name because some of y'all might log off. But he said, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. And sometimes we've got to hear something that pricks our heart, like in Acts chapter 2, that makes us look at something differently. That's what happened in Acts chapter 2. All of those people had crucified Christ. They were the reason why he was crucified. And they said, what shall we do? They were pricked by what Peter said. And it caused them to change their viewpoint, metanoia or repentance, change their viewpoint from looking at Jesus in one way to saying, oh, he really was who he said he was. And sometimes it is frustrating because we have to get our feelings hurt to change our perspective on certain things. Sometimes we have an expectation of people that we shouldn't have because our perspective on them or about them is wrong. Sometimes we have bias, and I'm going to get there, but sometimes we have bias. Sometimes racism comes in. Sometimes bias comes in. Sometimes prejudice comes in because we have a perspective on what we see in a person, not understanding who the person really is. And you've got to understand perspective. So what shapes our perspective? First thing, there are a lot of things, but here's one thing that shapes our perspective is our past experiences. Our past experiences determine a lot of times how we deal with our present reality. Let me say that again. Our past experiences determine how we deal with our present reality. And so because that guy in your past did you wrong, now you're looking at every guy that may come through the lens of that person. Because your mother or your father left you or left you out to dry, now you're looking at people or the way you raise your kids through the lens of your parents, right? Just because our parents handled something a certain way doesn't mean that that's the best way for us to handle it. And so your past experiences often shape your perspective, good and bad. Sometimes we can walk ourselves into bad relationships because we are expecting something of a future person or a present person that a past person used to do. Let me say that again. We can walk ourselves into bad relationships because we're expecting something from a present person that a past person used to do. And we put on them expectations that they don't deserve to have. And then we end up with what? Disappointment. So your past experiences can shape how you view the world. My guy, being open to understand different perspectives fosters open-mindedness, reduces conflict, and encourages collaboration. Man, go on and write the dissertation, bro. That's my guy Mathis, man. Go on and write the dissertation. Listen, your past experiences shape your perspective. And so often in our lives, it's so powerful that we reflect and we look back at how we were treated, not just relationally, right? But what has happened in our past that shapes how we deal with people, especially how we deal with ourselves and how we process problems in our future. Because a lot of times just that little shift will change how you deal with people moving forward. Change the way you look at things, and the things you look at begin to change. Let me say that again. Change the way you look at things, and the things that you look at begin to change. You start looking at that person differently. You start it's especially when you're talking about relationships like marriage relationships or a boyfriend, girlfriend, those types of things, whatever. When you're younger, you look for certain things. When you get older, you look for peace. Those certain things you used to look at don't even really matter as much as having peace, right? And so when you change the way you see things, the things that you see start to change. So past experiences. Here's the second thing that shape our perspective. The second thing is our education and our knowledge. Listen, the scripture says, my people perish for the lack of what? Knowledge, for the lack of education, for the lack of knowing things. And so often people who have an education think that they have the right perspective on everything. So because you got that DR in front of your name, you got that PhD on the end of your name, you got all of these different letters at the end of your name, and you've got these titles, and you're Archbishop this, and Chief Apostle that, and you're the Right Reverend this, and you got all of these titles. You think because you have a title that you have the proper perspective. And that's untrue. But on the flip side, sometimes we have the wrong perspective. Watch this, because we don't have enough information. Sometimes we have the wrong perspective because we don't have enough information. You can't diagnose it properly because you don't know enough about the topic. There are some people that come to me that ask about political questions, and I tell them straight up, I really don't know enough about this topic to be able to give you a wise answer, right? So sometimes it's having so much knowledge or having a title associated with our education or knowledge that makes us think that we have the right perspective. And then oftentimes it's not having enough information that makes us have the wrong perspective. Sam says this: we also need to have the right perspective on our past experiences so we can use them for growth. That's good. My boy P preached. My boy. Yes, sir. And so we have to have the right perspective based off of the knowledge that we have, based off the information. And that's why sometimes, even, and I'm going to use myself as an example, sometimes when I make a decision about a student in my school, sometimes the staff may not understand it because they don't know the information that I know about the child, or the child's past experiences, or the child's home life, right? They may not know it. And then when I explain that to them, they say, "Oh, now that makes sense, Doc. But I was mad at you for a minute." And sometimes, even with the knowledge that I may have, I still may make a wrong decision. But it's important for me to understand their perspective, right? So past experiences, education and knowledge, your values. What is it that you value? Like, what shapes your value system? What your values determine your perspective. They determine how you see things. You know, the way, what is right and wrong to you. What should be done and what should not be done. You know, it used to be where that was just so cut and dry. When I was growing up, it was this way or that way. Now it's so much gray area, and now we ask so many questions, and we don't know anything no more. We think we know so much. The values you have shape your perspective. And sometimes values just look different based off of how you was raised. And sometimes it's not a right or wrong. Sometimes it's just you value something that someone else doesn't value. Right? I've given this example plenty of times in my life with myself and my wife. And when we got married, and she don't like me using her as an example, but that's all that came to me. When we got married, when I came home, I expected to have something on the table to eat. She didn't that wasn't a part of her value system. She'd go to Zaxby's every day if she could. Right? That wasn't a part of her value. So I had to change my perspective and understand that relationally is not just my value system. I have to be aware of her value system as well. Now, it doesn't mean I have to always agree with that, but I have to be aware of her value system or other people's value system as well as I make decisions, right? And as I heap on people, like the old folks say, a level of expectation. I shouldn't expect something of someone who doesn't value the same thing I value. And sometimes we find ourselves in areas and levels of disappointment because we've heaped expectation on people who have a different value system than we have. Or they may have the same values and prioritize them differently. Right. And I think that's what happens politically. Some of us have the same value system. The ones on the right and the ones on the left may have the same value systems, but they prioritize them differently. And because they prioritize them differently, then they vote differently and they promote different things. Right. And so you have to understand your values. And when you're looking at it relationally, you have to understand the value system of those around you. Right. You have to understand that. If your purpose is peace. See, I think Paul says, live at peace with all men, right? If your purpose is to have peace, and that's just where I'm at, I'm going to have peace. I may not agree with you. We may disagree, but we're going to find a common ground where we can have peace, right? And if it's a right or wrong situation, at some point, we're going to figure out which one of us is right or wrong. But we can have peace. And I think we're living in a country now that's slowly getting away from the idea of differing values can coexist peacefully. Right? Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. Which one is right or wrong? I felt the quickening. Man, you crazy. All right. So values, I got to speed this up because I'm so far behind. The values. Here's the second thing: bias and preconceived notions. You look at someone, and based off of what they look like, you have a preconceived notion about what they value. Or you look at someone and based off of what they look like, you have a bias towards them. And listen, you have to address that internally. You have to address that internally. Listen, I tell people this all the time. See, as a school leader, I don't talk a whole lot at work. I really just don't talk a whole lot. I'm really an introvert. I can get on here and do this, and this is incredibly difficult, and I'm going to be drained out after I do this. But I'm an introvert, so I don't talk a whole lot. So sometimes people come to me with problems, and I tell them I'm already working on that. I saw that. And I tell people this all the time. I'm smarter than I let off. Like, I'm watching what's going on. I was having a meeting with one of my staff members last year, and I told him the date. I said, listen, around this date right here, you started to check out. What happened? And then he just paused. And then I told him what happened. I said, you had a conflict with this other staff member. It was a minor conflict, but it caused you to check out. And he couldn't believe that I knew that, because sometimes the way we present ourselves is different than who we actually are. So I'm always watching and paying attention, even if I don't speak or say anything. And sometimes preconceived notions, the way we look at people, the biases that we have based off of what someone may look like, or sometimes what they may say in a moment. And this is critical in our culture, because people will cut a video into 10 seconds and give it to you. And now you have a preconceived notion about someone that you did not hear what they said in its totality. Right. And so you have a preconceived notion about people, and that shapes your perspective. We've got to understand how to get rid of that in our lives so that we can be fair and equitable to everybody. You got to address your biases, which means you got to have some reflection time, and you got to have some conversations with yourself about, why am I biased toward this type of person? Why am I biased toward this person or that person? Why do I have preconceived notions? There's something that happened, or there's something that's going on that's causing me to see this in a way that I probably shouldn't see it. Right. And that's a conversation oftentimes that you got to have with yourself, because in many cases, we're not trying to discuss our biases with someone else. Pecan Tan says this: to acquire knowledge, one must study, but to acquire wisdom, one must observe. I need to write that down. To acquire knowledge, one must study, but to acquire wisdom, one must observe. Right? And that's good. And all wisdom is the application of the knowledge that you have. When you properly apply it and make the right decisions, you're considered wise. Right? So past experiences, education, knowledge, values, preconceived notions, and biases. Listen, I got one, maybe two more. But your knowledge of self shapes your perspective. This is probably the hardest one. Who are you? It's the hardest question that you could ever ask. Who are you? If I asked you who you are, if I ask you, and I do this a lot of times in interviews when I'm interviewing people, tell me about yourself. Tell me about who you are. And they start going to their titles, and they start going to what they've done, right? Because they're trying to get a job. I get it. But who you are is not your title. Who you are is not what you've done. Who you are is the core of your being. Like, who are you? And oftentimes when you don't know that, then your perspective is going to be off. When you don't know who you are and you're not confident in who you are, your perspective begins to change, or your perspective is shaped by your knowledge of who you are. And that knowledge of self is so important, because when you have that knowledge of who you are, you also know what you're capable of doing and what you're not capable of doing. You also know what it is that challenges you in a certain area and what it is that doesn't. You also know what it is that frustrates you and what doesn't. When you have a knowledge of yourself, then it helps you to understand the world around you and how you see things. I ain't gonna stay on that because we got to keep moving. But that knowledge of self is critical. That knowledge of my likes, my dislikes, my value system, my morality, right? That doesn't mean we don't make mistakes in certain areas of our life, even when we know who we are. But oftentimes those mistakes come because in that moment, we're not processing or reminding ourselves or affirming who we really are. And you're not what you've done. That's just the truth of it. You're not what you've done. Who you are is important to understand as you process the world around you. Listen, so what shapes our perspective? I'm gonna stop on that one. But past experiences, education and knowledge, values, preconceived notions, biases, and the knowledge of yourself. Those things shape who we are and how we diagnose the problems in our life. So you already know we have to look at the spiritual side of this. So we know what shapes our perspective practically. We've got a little bit of understanding of how to diagnose that. I'm gonna just say that if you're not spending time reflecting on your perspective in any area of your life, then you're not gonna grow. If you're a mother and you see things one way and you're not willing to look in your heart and say, listen, I might need to grow in this area. And reflection doesn't always mean changing. Reflection means I need to assess. Do I need to grow in this area? Do I need to change some things about me? Maybe I do and maybe I don't. But reflection is key to understand perspective. And if you're not spending any time reflecting on your decisions as a father, as a mother, as a employee, as a CEO, whatever, if you're not spending any time reflecting, then your perspective is never going to change. Not only is it not going to change, you're not going to know who you are if you don't spend time reflecting. You can't grow without reflecting. You can't repent without reflecting. You can't do anything effectively without reflecting on how it should be done. And that is so powerful and so critical. So what shapes our perspective are those things. And in order to shift those things in our life, we have to be reflective. And let me challenge you on this. If you're working, whether or not it's at work or whether or not it's at a church or whatever it is, under someone who is not reflective, it's incumbent upon you to ask them reflective questions. You know, Pastor, listen, I all due respect. Why do we run a church service like this? What is the reasoning? Why? You know, why if you're at your job, why do we make these decisions? What's the basis of making these decisions? Reflective questions causes people to see differing perspectives. All right. So let's look at this thing spiritually. I talked a little bit about and I'm gonna speed through this, but I talked a little bit about Caleb in the Bible. Not my son Caleb, but Caleb in the Bible. And there's a text in Numbers chapter 13 that talks about how Caleb and Joshua see something different than everybody else. And it's a little bit of reading. It's not a whole lot. It's a little bit of reading. But you probably ain't read your Bible all week. So let's look at it. Numbers 13, I think it's verse 25 to 31. I'm gonna read it quickly because I don't want you to think I'm making anything up. All right. And at the end of the 40 days, they returned from scouting out the land. The men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey. And here's some of its fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong." Notice the however there. Everything was there that was supposed to be there. And then he says, however, the people living in the land are strong and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites, I'm gonna mispronounce some of these words now. The Amalekites are living in the land of Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. Watch this verse here. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. But the men who had gone up and with him responded, we can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. Listen, perspective is all through that text, right? Because he sent out 12 people to survey the land. And only two, now this text doesn't say it, but there are other texts that says that it wasn't just Caleb, it was Caleb and Joshua. And they saw something, they saw the same thing the other 10 saw, but their report was different because their perspective was different. And so from that text, very quickly, there are three things that we have to understand spiritually about perspective. Number one is this: our perspective must be based on what God said. See, earlier in the text, it already says that God told them it was their land, but he didn't tell them about the obstacles in the land. And so often in our lives, we have a promise, we believe the promise, watch this, but God doesn't always tell us the obstacles that's going to come. And so when the obstacles come, we think that the promise is negated. And when they got there and they saw all of these people in the land that God didn't tell them about, they assumed that this can't be what he said. The question that we should ask ourselves whenever we're dealing with our perspective spiritually, and people are not going to like this, but what does God say about it? So the way that I vote is based off of what God said about it. The way that I process my value system is based off of what God said about it, first and primarily. Right. And so if our perspective is not based primarily off of what God said about it, then what are you basing your perspective off of? Spiritually speaking. And oftentimes the last question as we're attacking life and as we're dealing with problems in our life, oftentimes the last question we ask is, what did God say? We go and pray last and we consult everybody else first. And so our perspective must be based off of what God said. It's not your truth. The truth is whatever God says about it. And it's not about how you feel. It's not about how you feel about a thing. It's about what he said about a thing. Because everything is deeper than what it looks like. Everything that happens, here we try to be practical and we also try to be spiritual, but everything that happens on the practical side is fueled by something on the spiritual side, right? And Tony Evans says this quote, he says, if what you see is all you see, then you haven't seen all there is to be seen. Let me say that again. If what you see is all you see, then you haven't seen all there is to be seen. And so there are things that fuel what happens on the practical side. There are things that have already taken place that have come from something deeper than the way we process it practically. And so your first perspective, when you're dealing with things spiritually, when you're trying to solve problems, and let me tell you something, if you're trying to parent children, if you're trying to be in good relationships with people, and you're trying to do it absent of God, it's going to be a failure. Even a success without God is failure. You've got to include him in the decisions that you're making. And that means you have to allow him to shape your perspective. Okay, so the first thing in that story of Caleb and Joshua is that their perspective was based off what they already knew God had promised them. And for us in 2025, or maybe you're in 2028 and you're going to watch this later on, listen, for us, that has to be the written word that he's given us. You can't always trust what somebody is telling you if it don't line up with what's in the written word. And sometimes we wake up in the morning and say, God told me this in my sleep. No, that was that pizza you ate an hour before you went to bed. If it does not align with what he said in his word. And that's why it's so critical for us to spend time reading, spend time. I like me and my best friend Barry said, we got an appointment with the God of the universe. You got to spend time there to hear what he says, because that shall ultimately shape your perspective. And so spiritually, your perspective should be shaped about whatever God said about the topic first. Number two, Caleb does something in the text that is critical. The scripture says in 13, let me see if I can find it. In 13:30, it says, then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses. And sometimes, point number two is this, sometimes you've got to quiet some people that you may normally listen to in order to hear God's perspective on something. Doesn't mean they're bad people. But sometimes you've got to disengage from some people on some topics in order to hear what God is saying. Some people in your circle can't advise you on everything. I drink my coffee to that. Some people in your circle cannot advise you on everything. And there are some people in your circle that can give you great advice on a lot of things, but there are some things that some people can't talk to you about. And you've got to know that. That's that relational intelligence. You remember what I talked about when Jesus went up on the mountain? He didn't take all 12. He took 3 because the other 9 possibly weren't ready to see his perspective. They weren't ready to see that perspective yet. And some people you've got to disengage from or silence in certain conversations. It doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that on this topic, you may not be qualified enough for me to listen to that, because you're going to deter me. When I think about Peter walking on the water, I wonder what the other ones were saying. I'm pretty sure somebody said, hey, dog, boy, don't get out that boat. If you get out that boat, you going down. I'm sure somebody said something because they love Peter. And sometimes you've got to dismiss certain conversations in certain areas of your life to make sure that your perspective is aligned with God's perspective. Separate people's identity from their opinion and their perspective. I'm going to say that again. Separate people's identity from their opinion or their perspective. They are not their opinion and their perspective. They are a person. And sometimes when we're dealing with people who have different perspectives on life, we demonize them because their perspective is different than ours. We demonize them because they look differently than we look. We demonize them because they don't think about something the way that we think about it. And oftentimes, that's why you can't keep positive relationships around you, because you only want people who think the way you think, who are going to stroke your ego, who are going to make you sound and seem greater than you really are. And if you don't get people around you who have differing points of view and differing perspectives, you're going to struggle to grow in your life. Be careful who you allow to influence your perspective. See, Caleb silenced the rest of them. He said, I saw what y'all saw. I saw the I can't pronounce other people, Amalekites and the Hittites and the Jebusites. He said, I saw all them. I know it took 5-6 of us to carry this grape. We seen all of that. But we got a word that said we can overcome this. And when you're assessing, I'm trying to move on. If you're assessing the problems in your life, the first thing that you need is the right word, because it'll help you assess what you're dealing with. The right word will help you assess and process what you're going through. Right? I can overcome this if that's what he said. You got to have God's perspective. as you're dealing with things in your life. Don't mean you're going to do it perfectly. It don't mean you're going to hear him perfectly all the time. It don't mean you're not going to make mistakes. He knows that. But our primary focus has to be what he said. So point number one from Numbers 13:25-31 is our perspective must be based on what he said. Number two, sometimes you have to silence some people and not let them influence your perspective. You got to know when to do that. But here's the last thing. When you're looking from the right perspective, obstacles are stepping stones. See, Caleb saw the same thing everyone else saw. And he said, we can overcome it. And so often, one way that you can know when you're being led is when the problems that deter other folk are problems that you step over. It's not an easy step. But there are problems that you begin to step over to get to where you want to go. And I'll take it a step further. Sometimes when you have the proper perspective, you get excited when you see obstacles. Because what obstacles do is they cause you to rely on something or someone stronger than you are to help you to get to where you're going. And that's why I love doing this podcast, because I'm not qualified to do it. I have to be strengthened to do it. Right. So when I see, I'm an introvert. So when I see obstacles coming, my perspective has got to be, if you don't help me, I'm not going to be able to do this. And so what Caleb saw, look at what it says in verse number 2. It says, send men out of the land to Canaan. I am giving the land to the Israelites. This is before they went out there. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of the tribes. Listen, he had already promised them, God did, that they were going to have the land. When Caleb and Joshua saw the people in the land, they knew that the only way that we're going to be able to get to where we're going is through the help of God. And maybe you're too dependent on yourself. Maybe you can't see the right perspective because you're too dependent on yourself. And sometimes we have to see ourselves as weaker vessels to understand that my perspective is going to be shaped by my willingness to hear God's perspective. Listen, so point number one, I had a few more things, but I don't have time. Point number one is our perspective must be based off what he said. Point number two is you have to silence some folk. And you got to know when to do that. You got to be careful who you allow to influence your perspective. And point number three is this: when you look from the right perspective, obstacles are stepping stones. And it doesn't happen overnight. Listen, sometimes the victory is prolonged. Sometimes it's not an overnight thing. You don't win overnight. Sometimes you got to go through the process. And going through the process means, hey, I got to deal with those past experiences, Sam. I got to deal with what I know, my knowledge, my education. I've got to deal with my value system, prioritize things differently, right? I've got to deal with my biases, my preconceived notions. And I've got to understand my knowledge of self. And to speak frankly, until you ask the question, what does God say about this? It's going to be difficult for you to deal with those things. What does God say about part two? Man, please. What does God say about these things? Ask yourself, the next time you encounter an argument, if you can't answer that question, what did God say? Stop arguing. Go back, get some time with him, and figure out what's his opinion on it. So here's your closure. Here's your homework. What in your life do you need to take a different look at? See, the title of this was The Gift of a Different View. God will give us, it's a gift when somebody else comes with a different perspective, because it allows us to see things in us, allows us to see things relationally and how we can deal with other people. But it allows us to know if we're headed on the right direction. There's a gift in a different view. And so what in your life do you need to take a different look at? Maybe you need to look at parenting a little differently. Maybe you need to look at your collegial relationships, your professional relationships at work a little differently. Maybe you've been handling that staff member differently, or maybe you need to, or maybe you need to analyze or reflect on your political stances, right? Maybe you need to reflect on your faith. Maybe you need to reflect on those things. Maybe you need to start asking your pastor more questions. Maybe you need to take a look at how you're processing your life. Maybe you're struggling with things because of your perspective. Maybe it's not even really a struggle. You're making it a struggle because of your perspective. All right, look at those things in your life. That's your homework. Figure out what it is that you need to take a different look at. And once you do that, you can understand the power of a different view, the gift of a different view, and the power of perspective. Listen, I got a short prayer for you. Here it is. It's one sentence. Lord, help us to see things the way you want us to see them. In Jesus' name, amen.